These are the best and worst weapons in Apex Season 22. Now, imagine a tier list where the P2020 is no longer the worst gun in the game. Well, after 22 seasons in, that's where we're finally at. So let's get into it. Starting off D tier, first up is the charge rifle. And it's not a great weapon right now, particularly for controller players. I do know that if you play mouse and keyboard, this weapon is a bit better for that input. However, I see very few people actually running this weapon these days. And I think a couple reasons are it's just hard to use. It's rather awkward in a lot of ways. And don't get me wrong, it can certainly still deal a good amount of damage, but nearly every player is just going to go with something else that is easier to use and can be more flexible if they need to swap to a secondary in some sort of a close-up engagement. Not to mention, you need a lot of lead time with the charge rifle. Your target needs to be exposed for more time than the other weapons out there. I wouldn't be surprised if Apex tries buffing this weapon in a season or two. Next is the longbow. Now, can this deal some hefty damage like the charge rifle? Sure, absolutely. But when you compare it to the other guns that can fulfill this range role, there are so many better options. I'll talk about the better options later in the video, but the longbow just feels clunky and outdated currently. And if it was a stock, I would have sold it long ago. I am out on the longbow. Third in D tier, which is going to be really controversial to some of you, which doesn't need to be, but it's the RE45. Don't get me wrong, the RE45 is a decent starter weapon off of drop, but running this thing all game usually isn't a great idea. Of course, the hammer points do make it more viable, and if you can find that hop up along with an extended magazine, this could be a C or maybe even B tier weapon, I suppose, but it's a secondary. You can't really be using this as a primary due to its range limitations. And so for me, overall, it's D tier. And I know, there's a handful of you who are typing out that you beam your enemies all the time with it. I get it. It's just that the weird part about that is I never see you in my games doing that to me. So it's going D tier. Now, I do have to go on a little bit of a rant here before I get into C tier. And this is all about the weapon meta and how the game currently feels regarding it. First off, they need to buff the loot on E District. It feels like this map just has a fraction of the normal amount of loot that the other maps have. Not only that, it feels like there are a ton of different areas within the map where loot should be spawning. But there's almost a greater issue at play here, and that's the ammo amount. For whatever reason, it feels like they have nerfed ammo as well. Now, I know in some cases, like energy ammo stacks got nerfed, but they buffed light ammo and shotgun ammo stacks. But what I'm saying is, like, running out of ammo in a fight shouldn't be this big of an issue, but yet it is. And there are a couple problems. First, in this revival trios mode, you can extend or use a bunch of ammo on a fight, and then the guy you just killed gets to fly back in with more ammo than they just died with, and then begin fighting you all over. And if you don't ever get to loot their death box and recoup some ammo, then you're probably screwed. But even just a step beyond that, death boxes will disappear after a short while. I don't have the exact time duration, but they have literally disappeared right in front of me as I've been looting them, which is just a ridiculous thing. I don't understand it. If you are one of the players who is surviving and getting kills and thriving, I just don't feel like you should have to suffer from the problem of losing out on the ability to gather more ammo. It just shouldn't be this big of a problem on this map, and maybe it'll feel different on the other maps, but so far in E District, it feels like probably the biggest problem. I also don't like the change of reducing the amount of energy ammo that you can find, because it feels like we're now being manipulated into using a different weapon class where they didn't really buff the weapons in those classes, but I don't know, it's just kind of an awkward weapon meta right now. But let's get into C tier. First up is the alternator. Now, they removed the disruptor rounds, which significantly takes away the alternator's power. Yes, the alternator can be user-friendly and new player-friendly. It's a slow-firing SMG that has a rather controllable recoil, but its shortcomings will be apparent when you go up against a faster-firing weapon, which is basically like any weapon in the game. So it can be decent for that early to mid-game, but it doesn't really hold up as you get into later game, in my opinion. But the weird part about this is that the R99s in the care package, light ammo feels like the most common ammo type to find. So having an alternator feels really common, and I just wish they kind of buffed it if they're going to make it so available. But for now, I gotta leave it in C tier. Next in C tier is the G7 Scout, another light ammo gun that is good, but you need all of these attachments. And even once you have all of these attachments, there are better marksmen or snipers out there. If you're looking to farm some damage, the G7's great at that. It can also be a good weapon in ranked if you need that marksman weapon. But its bullet drop off can be rather steep within certain ranges, so I just don't think it's as good as some of these other marksmans that I'll talk about here shortly. The second to last in C tier is the Rampage. Now, I was really close to putting this one in B tier, but without charging it up, it's just not very good. I mean, sure, if you're hip firing it up close, it's obviously better, but this thing just shoots so slow without a thermite. And in most instances, it just feels like a terrible weapon to use. So I gotta go C tier for now. And lastly in C tier is the car. Now technically the alternator, the car, and also the RE all got slightly buffed because they increased the ammo capacity in the mag size. But to me, if you're running out of ammo, you're not really going to be able to feel this. But seriously though, like, an extra bullet doesn't really matter a whole lot in these weapons, particularly the car. I think the car probably, you could convince me, could go into B tier, but it's just not that good due to all the nerfs it's received in the previous seasons. They've ruined hip firing with SMGs for the most part. The car can't even take a laser sight. Not that laser sights are that useful. So I'm just going to leave it in C tier. It's a mid weapon. You might use it as a secondary, but not a great primary, and it has a bunch of limitations on it. Okay, now moving on to B tier. First up in B tier is the EVA 8. Now the EVA 8 comes out of the care package this season, back to floor loot. You can put the boosted loader hop up on it, although this doesn't really feel like a great hop up for the weapon. I don't know, it's kind of awkward. Like, yeah, okay, it's nice to get the faster reload and some extra bullets, but I don't know, it doesn't really feel like it needs to go on the EVA. However, with that said, the EVA 8 is certainly a viable secondary, but it has some limitations when it comes to any sort of ranged encounter. You need to be in barrel stuffing range with this weapon. And yes, with a few shotgun pumps, you're probably downing your enemy, but it doesn't really shake out the same way when you compare it to the Mastiff or the Peacekeeper, and so for that reason, I'm going to leave it in B tier for now. Second in B tier is the Sentinel. Now, I think the Sentinel is by far the best sniper on the floor loot. It's way better than the charge rifle or the longbow. If you're able to charge up the Sentinel with a shield cell, you're hitting 88 to the body, and I think as high as 132 or 126 to the head, something crazy. Needless to say, one Sentinel shot can swing an entire fight, and this gun is very easy to use. It's very satisfying to use. The bullet drop doesn't feel significant at all, and just feels like the purest form of a sniper that we have when it comes to the ground loot. And I would consider even putting the Sentinel in A tier with how effective it can be at times. Third in B tier is the 30-30. Despite the 30-30 receiving some nerfs over the last couple seasons, it's still a very good marksman. Of course, you need a sight on this weapon in order to see anything and for it to be moderately effective, but I found that with the charging up nature of this gun, it's still really strong. It's better than the Scout for sure, and I would say it's rather equal to another marksman I'll talk about here in just a moment. But if you're looking for some sort of ranged weapon to use, whether you're in ranked or in pubs or whatever, 30-30 is a great option. All right, moving down the list in B tier, I'm going to group the akimbo weapons together right now, the Mozam and the P20. They're both B tier weapons in my opinion. I've seen some people say that they're incredibly overpowered. I haven't felt that yet. I think they're balanced perfectly fine. I think they're fun additions to the game. They certainly make two weapons that have historically been rather irrelevant way more useful. Now, a couple things to mention. On both of these akimbo weapons, if you use your alternate interact key, which for me is left on the D-pad, you can bring out just one of the weapons if you want to use it. And that's why when you pick up a sight and you have akimbo, it shows that you picked it up, but it doesn't show it on the weapon. If you switch to just one of them, they will now have the sight on it. Now, the P20 did technically get slightly nerfed because they reduced its magazine size rather significantly, and they decreased the damage with the hammer point attached from 27 down to 23. However, overall, they did increase the P20's damage from 18 up to 21. So they sort of cancel each other out. But the thing I like about the P20 is that you can spam this thing much easier than the Mozam, obviously. And so for that reason, with the hammer point, I think the dual P20s is honestly a really, really good secondary to use. You don't want to be running the akimbos as a primary due to the range limitations. However, I think I like the P20 better. But with that said, the Mozambique is honestly a good option this season as well. They reduced the damage for a full blast with the hammer point to 54 from 60, but they increased the rate of fire significantly. If you're able to get a gold or a purple shotgun bolt on the Mozam, it's going to be blasted. I do think at times switching to just one Mozam though with the hammer points and a good shotgun bolt can be extremely helpful in that awkward medium range engagement, like 20-25 feet away from your opponent. Having a singular Mozam with a hammer point is actually still a really viable weapon here. Most people don't use it that way. Most people don't really use the Mozam ever until this season, but from someone who's been using the Mozambique for the last several seasons, trust me, it's a viable option in that range if you need it to be. Props to Apex for coming up with a way to make these two weapons not only more fun to use, but more useful as well in the weapon meta. Moving down the list in B tier, I've got the R301. Now the 301 was buffed slightly by increasing its mag capacity by 3 bullets for all mag sizes, including the base. This is definitely a nice change, but I'm not sure it makes the gun meta again. The 301 hasn't been in the meta for what feels like like well over a year now, which is a bummer because while the 301 was a rather easy weapon to use, I never felt like it was too strong like some other weapon metas that we've had. It just felt balanced. Personally, I wish Apex would go back to making more weapons viable with their hipfire because too many guns nowadays are so far from what they used to be in the hipfire range. And I always thought the hipfiring in this game is what made it stand out from other shooters. But with that said, the R301's hipfire is decent because last season they did buff it slightly. It's obviously just not as good as it used to be. So you can still use this gun for mid or close range engagements and find a good amount of success with it. Next is the L-Star. With the reverse hipfire mechanic added, the L-Star is definitely better up close now than it was, say, last season, but it can still be somewhat hard to use. The visual clutter obviously is still a drawback, and at certain ranges, this weapon feels really inconsistent with where the bullets are going. Sometimes I feel like it just has a random spray pattern. I think if you get the gun shield generator hop up, it makes the gun better, but I can't really say it would go into A tier. And of course, with the nerf to energy ammo, it makes running this weapon throughout a match even more difficult. So B tier for now. Okay, next is the Spitfire. And obviously with the gun shield hop up, it makes the Spitfire better this season along with the hipfire buff. But the Spitfire just feels very limited at those mid-range engagements. With the slower firing nature of these bullets, sometimes it just feels like you can't use it the same way you may want to. For instance, if you try to compare this weapon to the 301 at that mid-range engagement, the 301 is far better. But if you're up close, the Spitfire is probably better. You're gonna have to weigh these pros and cons when it comes to what you're looking for out of your loadout, but overall putting the Spitfire in B tier feels pretty accurate. However, do keep in mind with all of these LMGs that your strafe speed while you're ADSing is much slower than some other weapon classes. Now this does affect the weapon's ranking in my opinion because it doesn't make it as flexible as say an AR, but it does feel like Apex really wants us to run LMGs this season, but I'm just not really gonna do it too much. All right, second to last in B tier is the triple take. I think the triple take is honestly a very good weapon, but it's not meta. Hear me out. In terms of marksman rifles, it's got to be the easiest one to use. The drawback is obviously when you go for a fully charged shot, it may hit for something like 87, or even a headshot can be over 100, but it's those subsequent shots that hit for 19 or 21 that really kind of make me think this weapon has to be in B tier. You're essentially getting a trade-off. The easier gun to use when compared to the 30-30 or the Scout. It's also a much better weapon to use up close if you have to use it that way, like a shotgun or something. But in exchange for those things, you're going to get an inconsistent output in damage. It's essentially the marksman's shotgun. So I think a lot of newer players like to use it, and I think using it in ranked for that marksman role is viable, but don't ignore its limitations. And lastly, in B tier is the wingman. Now last season I put the wingman in A tier, and a lot of you guys disagreed. And while I think in some situations the wingman is still very strong, the fact we can't put sniper mags on it is really, really bad this season, especially since the Mozam and the P20 can have so many more shots with akimbo being a thing now. Also, with the nerf to aim assist this season, the wingman should have been allowed to use extended mags again. Until then, it's going to be B tier for now. It's still decent, but it's way too high risk with only 6 shots, and other weapons just have far more potential. And I know there's the boosted loader out there, but to be honest, that hop-up is not spawning as much as this new gun shield hop-up, and overall the boosted loader is just not that strong. It's definitely one of the weakest hop-ups in the game, especially for the fact that it's a gold hop-up. But enough about B tier, let's move on to A tier. Starting off A tier is the Nemesis. Now, the Nemesis is obviously not as good as it once was, but it's still really strong, especially in the mid-range engagements. The best part about this gun is the automatic aspect to the burst firing. This makes it much better than the Hemlock and a little bit more consistent when it comes to controlling the shots as your opponent may be moving or playing around cover. Now, finding enough energy may prove to be difficult this season, which may impact how often you'll be able to run it throughout a whole match. But for me, this is definitely one of the weapons that I will look for nearly every match. Second in A tier is the Volt. Now, the downside to the Volt is the nerfs it's received over, well, the last year or so. They made it not as good at medium range because of the bullet velocity and the bullet trajectory. But up close, this is definitely one of the best SMGs to use. I also think a lot of newer players enjoy using it because the recoil isn't sporadic or wild or hard to control. It's very user-friendly. The Volt is also probably the only SMG currently that you could potentially use as a primary if you wanted to. As I said, it's not going to really stand up in the medium range, but because of its easy recoil, it could potentially fulfill that role somewhat. But it's still a very, very very good secondary to have. Third is the Hemlock, another weapon that was nerfed this season. Now, they increased the time between the bursts, they decreased the damage by 1, which is down to 19 from 20, and they reduced the ammo capacity in the white and blue magazines. I could definitely feel the nerf when I've used it, and it makes the gun not as good as last season, obviously, but it's still a pretty good weapon right now. I know the gun was really strong last season, but I don't really feel like they should have nerfed it, especially since it felt like they buffed it and they knew it was going to be strong, but they only left it for like a season. So I'm leaving it in A tier for now. Next up is the Flatline, and the Flatline, oddly enough, received a nerf this season where they decreased the bullet capacity in all of the magazines by 1. This feels incredibly unnecessary. The Flatline was not a meta weapon by any means. I know a lot of people still enjoy using it, but it's not even close to as good as it used to be. And so nerfing the bullet capacity feels unnecessary. This is another weapon where I think they should buff the hip fire back to how it used to be, or pretty close to how it used to be, because the hip fire on it, once again, feels like a random spray at times. Next is the Prowler, and there were no changes to the Prowler this season, but it's still one of the better SMGs available and can prove to be a beast up close. I don't think there's too much more to say on it other than if you want a nice close range burst gun, the Prowler is awesome. And it's rather consistent when compared to shotguns. If you don't really like running a shotgun, I think the Prowler is the next best option. Okay, second to last is the R99, and they buffed the heck out of the R99 and put it in the care package. But when I used it, I kind of felt like, well, this is just how the R99 should feel on floor loot. If you haven't played the last few seasons, they nerfed the heck out of the R99, making it essentially irrelevant. And so when they put it into the care package, they added some interesting aspects to it that we had never seen before. One being that there is no movement penalty while using it, so you actually move very fast, whether you're ADSing or not. The second thing is that there's a damage fall off as you're farther away from your opponent. So if you use it at range and you are successful at it, you're penalized for it, which to me is just extremely counterintuitive. If you're able to control the recoil of a gun like the R99 at medium range and you're hitting your opponent, why should you be penalized in the damage numbers? Just doesn't make sense. So for that reason, I'm leaving it in A tier. However, if you see this on the care package, definitely grab it, try it out. It's a very, very strong weapon. But when I used it, it just didn't scream care package weapon. And I remember feeling this way back in I think it was season 6 when they put the R9 in the care package. It just felt like an awkward fit. And lastly, in A tier is the Peacekeeper. Now, as you probably know, they changed around the blast pattern with the PK this season, but honestly, I swear it feels like it's shooting slower. Now, they didn't mention that they changed anything with the shots like that, but I've even had a couple friends mention this as well. So if anyone else has felt this, please comment below. Anyways, the weapon is still strong, but I can't put it in S tier right now. It feels too slow, and you definitely need a shotgun bolt more than ever. I also don't really love the change in the blast pattern at the moment. Maybe I need more time to get used to it, but I felt like the Peacekeeper didn't really need an adjustment in this way. They said they changed the blast pattern so the shotgun hits should be more consistent. So instead of hitting for 9, well, now you're gonna hit for 11 or maybe 22 if you're lucky. And that's just been my experience so far. So it can be very strong in certain moments, but it's sort of canceled out by the fact that it shoots slow, and at times you're still gonna hit for that one pellet, which is not great. Okay, now we're moving on to S tier, the best of the best. Starting it off is the Havoc. The Havoc being the best weapon on floor loot over the last couple seasons, it's finally received some nerfs. First being the decrease in ammo capacity halfway through last season, and now with a hipfire nerf. However, the gun is still one of the best guns in the game, hence why it's in S tier. If they really wanted to take it down off its throne, they could have nerfed it more. So while the hipfire is certainly worse, you can still annihilate someone with it up close. However, as I've mentioned, finding enough energy ammo may be a problem, so watch out for that. Second in S tier is the Mastiff. Now they increased the damage to 15, it previously was 11, but in a trade-off for reducing the pellet count to 6, which it previously was 8. Now with the Mastiff having this horizontal pellet spread, it's made this gun far better this season. Of course, you still need a shotgun bolt, but you can pump some people for 90 to the body, or even over 100 if you hit a headshot. So I think it's probably the best close range weapon right now when it comes to the damage potential, but I haven't seen too many people catch on to how good the Mastiff is yet. So maybe throughout the season, this will become more apparent, but it's definitely an S tier pick, trust me. And then finishing off S tier, I have the Kraber, the Bow, and the Devotion. Now, I'm not going to spend time talking about the Kraber and the Bow because there were no changes to them. They are obviously all care package weapons, but the Devotion however, did receive a buff, which is once again a rather perplexing move. Out of all the weapons that didn't need a buff, well, the Devotion received one. They incorporated the gun shield hop up to this, giving you that extra health while you ADS with it. They made the hip fire better, and they decreased the reload time when you use the whole magazine. A confusing move to say the least, as this thing was already insanely strong, but yeah, if you see a Devotion, don't leave it laying around. This gun can easily win you a fight, and it honestly should be in a tier above S tier with how good it is. Well, if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching, and if you want to learn about the best and worst legends, I covered it in this video here. Peace.